Leave the bike's basement now. Megan Hartwell didn't ask. She didn't warn twice. She planted herself in front of 64 men who outweighed her by 100 pounds each, looked straight into the storm rolling toward them, and she screamed it like a woman who had already decided she would die before she let another person walk out that door into what was coming. Nobody moved. And then everything changed. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning the Hells Angels rode into Red Willow, Kansas, Megan Hartwell had already been awake for 4 hours. That was standard, had been standard since the accident. Since the Tuesday 8 years ago when a state trooper knocked on the door of her rented duplex on Millbrook Drive and told her that Danny was gone, that a truck had crossed the center line outside Salina, that he had not suffered, and that she needed to call someone to come be with her. She remembered staring at the man's badge while he talked. She remembered that she did not call anyone. She remembered going to the kitchen, sitting down at the table, and looking at the stack of unpaid bills Danny had been meaning to sort through that weekend. She had sorted through them herself. That was 8 years ago. Now she sorted through the books of the Copper Lantern Roadhouse, the failing, half-patched, deeply beloved wreck of a building she had sunk every dollar and every hour into since she walked away from her accounting job in Wichita, bought 60 acres of highway-adjacent land for a number that should have been illegal, and decided that the thing she was going to do with her grief was feed people. Not fix people, not save people, feed them. The Copper Lantern had a simple philosophy, and the philosophy was, if you were hungry, you could eat. If you were tired, you could sit. If you needed to use the phone was on the wall behind the register, and Megan didn't ask questions. She had posted the actual rules on a laminated card above the coffee station, and there were only 3 of them. Don't steal. Don't disrespect Tessa. Pay what you can. That last one had gotten her in trouble with her accountant, a dry-humored man named Leonard Pruitt, who had told her twice that pay what you can was not a sustainable pricing model for a commercial establishment in a county with declining foot traffic and an overdue roof. Leonard, she had said the last time he brought it up, I have never once asked for your opinion on my roof. She had, however, asked Rachel for her opinion. That was a mistake. Rachel Hartwell was 4 years younger, substantially better organized, and perpetually worried about her older sister in the specific, grinding way that people worry about someone who keeps making choices they cannot argue with, but cannot quite respect either. Rachel had driven out from Topeka 6 weeks ago for what she said was a birthday visit, and was actually an intervention dressed in birthday clothes. Megan, she had stood in the kitchen doorway with a printed spreadsheet in her hand. Rachel always had a printed spreadsheet. You are 4 months behind on the banknote. 3.5. The roof estimate came in at $22,000. I know. You know what's going to happen if you can't make the June payment? Megan had turned from the stove. I know what's going to happen, Rach. Then why are you? Why are you still giving away? I'm not giving anything away. She said it quietly, which was the way she said the things she meant most. I'm running a business the way I think a business should run. If that's not viable, I'll figure out what's next. But I'm not going to run it differently, just because the numbers are making you nervous. Rachel had driven back to Topeka. The spreadsheet remained on the kitchen counter. Megan had not thrown it away because the numbers were making her nervous too. She just refused to let that show on her face until after closing. Tessa Boyd had worked the Copper Lantern for 5 years. She was 26, from a farm outside Atwood, and she had the kind patience that came from spending a childhood learning how to wait out weather. She was good with difficult customers, better with difficult situations, and absolutely fearless about telling Megan when she thought she was wrong, which she did respectfully, directly, and only once per topic. It was Tessa who saw the convoy first. She came through the kitchen door with a half-empty coffee pot and said, without looking up, Megan, there's a situation in the parking lot. Megan was checking the grease trap. What kind of situation? The kind that has chrome on it. She came out from the kitchen and stood in the doorway. The parking lot of the Copper Lantern was not a large parking lot. It accommodated about 30 cars comfortably, 40 if people were cooperative, and anything beyond that required use of the gravel overflow area that stretched to the tree line. What was currently pulling into that parking lot and the overflow area, and actually partially onto the highway shoulder because there was simply not enough room, was 64 motorcycles. Not just motorcycles, Harleys, every one of them. Road Kings, Electra Glides, custom builds that looked like they'd had a decade of specific, intentional love poured into every surface. And on the leather, the vests, the cuts, the patches that announced membership as clearly as any name tag. 3 words that announced who these men were and where they came from. Hell's Angels. One of the waitresses from the afternoon shift, a part-timer named Josie, who had been rolling silverware at a corner table, stood up so fast she knocked her coffee onto the floor. She pointed at the back door. You're gonna stay, Megan said. Not loudly, not unkindly, just with the tone she used when she was not discussing the matter further. Josie sat back down and began mopping up the coffee with a stack of napkins. The motorcycles cut their engines in a rolling sequence, one after another, the sound dying down until the parking lot was quiet, except for the tick of cooling metal and the wind moving through the cottonwood trees at the edge of the lot. Megan counted 6 rows, roughly 10 to a row, with the last column ragged because the overflow space wasn't even. 64. The man who dismounted first was the one she would later understand was their road captain, though she didn't know that yet. She knew only that he moved with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of someone who had never needed to rush to establish authority. He was in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the cut look like it had been built around him rather than worn. He had a full beard going gray at the jaw and a face that showed neither aggression nor welcome. He was simply looking at the building, the way a person looks at something they are about to deal with. He walked toward the entrance. Megan opened the door before he reached it. 64 people, she said. Coffee's ready. Food'll take 20 minutes, maybe a little more, because my flat top is already going and I'm going to need to prioritize. You want to send someone to help me figure out portions? I won't turn that down. The man stopped. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, most places call the county when they see us pull in. Most places are worried about the wrong things, Megan said. You hungry or not? He studied her for another 2 seconds. We're hungry, then come in. She stepped back from the door. Fair warning, one rule about my waitress. Her name is Tessa. You say please and thank you to Tessa, or I will ask you personally to find somewhere else to eat. And I won't feel bad about it. The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something that had been a smile a long time ago and hadn't fully forgotten how. Understood, he said. His name, she learned when he ordered black coffee, eggs over hard wheat toast, no jam, was Grant Maddox. The road name was Raven, which she would use later, but called him Grant the first time, because she hadn't been told yet and wouldn't have used it until she was. He sat at the counter rather than at one of the tables. That surprised her. The dining room filled in a way that Megan had never seen it fill before. The Copper Lantern held about 60 people at capacity, which meant she was immediately 4 over and operating on the not quite legal edge of her occupancy permit, a fact she filed away and declined to act on. The riders spread through every available space, booths, counter stools, the folding chairs she kept in the storage room for peak periods. Several of them pulled the folding chairs into the gaps between the booth tables and sat with their knees nearly touching the backs of strangers. They were louder than her usual lunch crowd, substantially louder. But it was not the kind of loud that made her tense. It was the loud of a large group of people who had been traveling and were relieved to stop. Tessa moved through them with the competence of someone who had served oil roughnecks during the Hugoton Field expansion and had once talked down a bar fight between 2 rival combine crews. She remembered orders without writing them down for the first 12, switched to a notepad only when the volume exceeded her reliable recall, and at no point did her expression suggest she found any of this remarkable. Josie, The part-time silverware roller recovered faster than Megan had expected. She was taking drink orders from a table of 5 near the window within 10 minutes. And if her handwriting on the order slips was slightly shakier than normal, nobody mentioned it. In the kitchen, Megan cooked. She had cooked professionally for 8 years, which meant she cooked the way certain people drive in bad weather, with total attention, no wasted movement, and a specific quality of calm that looked like stillness but was actually sustained concentration. Danny had called it her battle face. She'd never loved that expression, but she had never found a better one. She worked the flat top, the grill, and the fryer in a rotation that her body knew without being told. She built plates. She called orders. She adjusted timing based on what Tessa was telling her about which tables had been waiting longest and what the far corner booth had changed their mind about. From where she stood at the grill, she could see through the pass-through window to the counter. She could see Grant Maddox, who had not looked at his phone once since sitting down, which she noticed because almost no one under 70 was capable of that. He was drinking his coffee and watching the room, not watching it the way a suspicious person watches a room, but the way a responsible person does, like he was keeping an informal count. The younger one sat 3 stools down from him. Dylan Monroe, who she would come to know as Sparks, was 23 or 24, with forearms covered in the kind of ink that meant he'd started young and added things over time rather than planned it all at once. He ate fast. He ate the way people eat when they're used to not knowing when the next meal is coming, which she recognized because she had done the same thing at 23, working doubles at a diner in Wichita while Danny finished his electrician's cert. He caught her looking through the pass-through and had the grace to look momentarily embarrassed. "Good," she called. "Really good," he said. "Like really good. You make the biscuits yourself." "Every morning." "My grandmother made biscuits," he said, and there was something in his voice that sat differently than the rest of what he'd said. "Was she a good cook?" "She was a great cook." He paused. "She died last year." Megan slid another biscuit onto a side plate and put it in the window. "On the house," she said. "For her." He took it without saying anything else, but he ate it slowly, which she noticed. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted by the halfway point of the meal. Not dramatically. Not the kind of shift that announces itself. Just the incremental relaxation that happens when strangers eat together, and the food is decent, and nobody has done anything to make anyone feel unwelcome. 2 of the older riders had found the chess set. Megan kept on the shelf behind the pie case she'd put it there because she'd seen an interview with a psychiatrist who said elderly men who played chess showed reduced rates of cognitive decline, and she had a regulars table of 4 retired farmers who came in every Thursday, and she'd wanted to have something for them. And they were playing a surprisingly serious game on the corner of a 2-person table while a small audience of 3 looked on. Someone had started a running joke about the folding chairs that Megan couldn't fully follow from the kitchen, but that was generating genuine laughter every few minutes. Tessa was in it, which was a good sign. Grant Maddox had not moved from the counter. He finished his eggs and was on his second coffee, which he had not asked for. Tessa had simply noticed the cup was empty and filled it, and he had said thank you. And Tessa had said, "You're welcome." And that had apparently been the entire transaction. Megan refilled her own coffee and came around from the kitchen. She stood behind the counter across from him. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Missouri." He said, "Kirby Flats." She didn't know the town. He saw that. "We lost a brother," he said. It wasn't explanation so much as fact. He said it the way people say things they have already said many times and are still not used to saying. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once. He'd been riding with us for 22 years. "What was his name?" He looked at her. Riders, she would learn later, were accustomed to people not asking that question. Accustomed to people being interested in the death in the abstract but not in the person. "Eddie Callahan," he said. "How old?" 59. "Young," she said. "Yeah." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. "Too young." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, through the front window, the sky had shifted. It had been an ordinary, humid Kansas afternoon when the convoy pulled in, the kind of thick, close heat that settled in June and made the air feel used. But something had changed in the quality of the light. Megan became aware of it gradually, and then all at once. The first thing she noticed was the birds. Not a reduction in bird noise, a total absence of it. The cottonwoods had been busy all afternoon. Mockingbirds, red-winged blackbirds, the particular conversational chaos of a healthy tree line on a summer day. She had not been conscious of hearing it, but she had been hearing it the way you hear the refrigerator hum, and now it had stopped. The second thing she noticed was the glasses. She kept a row of water glasses on the shelf, behind the bar drying rack, left to right, the way she'd always done it. They were trembling, not falling, just trembling, slightly, the water inside them catching the light as it shivered. She put her hand on the bar. The bar was vibrating. The pressure in her ears changed. She crossed the dining room in 6 steps, moving fast enough that several riders looked up. She went to the shelf below the register where she kept the weather radio, turned it on, and pressed it to volume. The mechanical voice was mid-sentence, confirmed on the ground, moving northeast at 42 miles per hour. Currently 3 miles west-southwest of Red Willow. She turned. Grant Maddox was already standing. He had heard it from the counter. She could see from his expression that he understood exactly what 3 miles west-southwest at 42 miles per hour meant in terms of arrival time. It meant minutes. It meant not enough of them. The dining room took another 4 seconds to understand. Then someone near the front window said something. She didn't hear the words, and someone else stood up, and within 30 seconds, the entire room was moving. Toward the exit, toward the motorcycles. Listen to me. Megan put herself in front of the main door. She was 5 feet 6 inches and 140 pounds, and she stood in front of 64 men and said it again. Louder. Listen to me right now. The room slowed. That storm is going to be here in 4 minutes, maybe less. You cannot outrun a tornado on a motorcycle. You cannot outrun it in a car. There is a basement under this building. It held through the tornado of 9. It will hold through this one. But I need every person in this room moving toward the kitchen right now. My bike, someone started. Your bike is a machine, she said. You are not. Lady, you don't. She raised her voice by exactly 1 register. Not screaming, not pleading. The voice of someone who will not move and knows it. I said basement, now. Leave the Harleys and move. And in the back of the room, Grant Maddox's voice joined hers. You heard her. Let's go. Nobody argued with him. Almost nobody. Dylan Monroe Sparks was 3 steps from the back door when Megan caught his vest with both hands. He was bigger than her by 60 pounds and stopped more from surprise than from her grip. Overpass, he said, breathless. If I can just get the bike under the overpass, Dylan. She used his name before she'd consciously decided to. She had heard someone call him that from a booth. An overpass is a wind tunnel. It will pick you up and carry you half a mile and put you down in a field. I have read every report from every person who survived 2011 in Joplin, and not one of them was under an overpass. Not one. He looked at her. He looked at the back door. The sound was beginning now, not the freight train roar people described. Not yet, but something lower and more sustained, a pressure in the air that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. His face, she said. Right now. He went. Raven was at her shoulder. Clear? He kitchen. 2 bathrooms, the storage room, she said. I need to check all of them. Then go left, he said. I'll go right. They separated. She went through the kitchen calling out, finding no one. The storage room was empty. The bathroom by the kitchen door was empty. She ran back toward the hall and nearly collided with Raven coming the other way. Clear, he said. Let's go. They were the last 2 into the basement. He got the door reinforced steel, set into a concrete frame, the one thing she had spent real money on when she'd bought the property, and she heard him throw both bolts from inside. Above them, the world ended. The cellar measured roughly 30 by 20 feet. It had been a root cellar before she bought the property, then a storm shelter when she rebuilt it, and she had spent $11,000 in 6 weekends of her own labor. Making it what it now was reinforced block walls, a poured concrete ceiling, 3 emergency lanterns on magnetic mounts, a medical cabinet bolted to the far wall, a water tank, and a ventilation pipe with a manual cap. It had been designed for 40 people. There were 71 people in it now. When the lights went out, the power pulled. Before she'd taken 2 steps toward the lanterns, the darkness was immediate and absolute. And the sound that replaced it was the kind of sounds that rewires something fundamental in the human animal. It was enormous. It was everywhere. It had no direction because it came from every direction simultaneously, and beneath it was a vibration that moved through the floor and the walls and the air itself. Someone cursed, low and involuntary. Someone else was praying. A woman, one of the stranded motorists, a grandmother from Oklahoma, who had been eating a piece of cherry pie alone at a table when the riders arrived, was making a soft, rhythmic sound that might have been humming. Megan got the first lantern. The light wasn't much enough to see faces, enough to see the room. She passed the second lantern to the closest person she recognized, a heavy-set rider with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and pointed to the far corner. He went without being told. Injured to the east wall, she said. If you're hurt, sit down on the east wall. If you are not hurt, stay standing. We need the floor space. She felt the ceiling shift before she heard it. A deep, groaning flex of concrete that lasted 2 seconds and stopped. Several people looked up. It's holding, she said. The ceiling is holding. Keep your eyes level. Looking up makes your brain think it's moving more than it is. Raven was beside her. He had one of the riders, a man with a bleeding cut above his eye, sitting against the wall and was applying direct pressure from what looked like a folded bandana. She went to the medical cabinet and brought back gauze and medical tape and handed it to him without a word. The stairwell groaned. Everyone heard it. The center brace, a reinforced wood beam that had been original to the cellar structure and that she had meant to replace and had not found the money to replace, made a sound like a rifle shot as one of its anchor points pulled free. The stairwell began to lean. Far wall, she said. Everyone back against the far wall now. They moved. Raven did not. He positioned himself at the base of the compromised stairwell and put his shoulder against it. Raven, I've got it, he said through his teeth. You're going to tear your shoulder out. Then I'll tear my shoulder out. He adjusted his stance. Get someone on the other side. She looked at the room. The heavy-set rider with the reading glasses was already moving toward her. It took 3 of them, Raven, the heavy-set rider, and a 4th man who came in without being asked to keep the stairwell from completing its collapse. They held it for what felt like a very long time. Megan could hear the structure above them, not just the wind now, but the specific mechanical sounds of a building being disassembled, the groan and crack of the roof going, the particular hollow percussion of objects striking the exterior walls in sequence. She moved through the room. She checked the woman from Oklahoma, who was still humming, and held her hand for a moment and said, You're doing great. She checked the man with the cut above his eye, whose bleeding had slowed. She found Dylan Monroe sitting with his knees drawn up and his back against the wall, staring at the middle distance. She sat down next to him. You okay? She said. He looked at her. My bike's up there. I know. I've been building it for 3 years. His voice was flat, in the way voices go flat when the feeling behind them is too large to carry in ordinary expression. Every spare weekend, every extra dollar. I know, she said again. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. It's a machine, he said. Like you said. Yeah, she paused. Still hurts. Yeah. He looked at the ceiling. Is this building going to hold? Yes, she said. She said it without hesitation, which was important. She said it because it needed to be said, and because she believed it, and because the value of a lie told in a basement during a tornado to a 23-year-old who was frightened was approximately 0, and she did not deal in those. Then the sound above them peaked, became something so large it lost its character as sound, and became simply presence, and then, over the course of 45 seconds that felt considerably longer, began to diminish, and then it was quiet, not immediate quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives in layers, the way hearing returns after something too loud. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Raven said, "From the stairwell, is that it?" Megan listened. The vibration was gone. The pressure had equalized. Through the ventilation pipe, she could hear nothing. Ordinary nothing. "That's it," she said. She stood up. Crossed to the stairwell. The bolts were bent slightly from the pressure differential, but they still moved. And she threw them back and put her shoulder against the door. It didn't move. "Debris," someone said. Raven was already beside her. 3 men joined him. They hit the door together twice. And on the second push, it gave 6 inches a foot. Then a reluctant scraping groan as whatever was against it shifted and slid. The first thing she saw through the gap was the sky. Not a sliver of it, the way you see through a partly open door. All of it. The entire sky, wide and washed, and a strange clarified blue in the way Kansas sky goes after a storm has moved through. There was no roof above the stairwell. There was no second floor. There was, on 3 sides, a partial remaining wall, and on the 4th side, open air, and somewhere in the mid-distance, a sound that she identified after a moment as the settling of debris. They climbed out one at a time, carefully, because the floor above, what remained of the floor above, was unstable. Megan came out last. She stood on the foundation slab of the Copper Lantern Roadhouse and looked at what 8 years had become. The sign was in the parking lot, bent at 90 degrees, the copper lantern face down in the gravel. The dining room was gone, the walls, the ceiling, the booth tables. She had reupholstered herself the spring before last. The shelf with the water glasses, the chess set she had bought because of a documentary about elderly men and cognitive decline. The kitchen was a concrete floor and a refrigerator lying on its side. The storage room had no walls. One walk-in cooler door stood upright in the gravel, perfectly vertical, for no reason she could determine. Scattered across the fields on both sides of the highway, across the fence lines, into the drainage ditches, one of them as far as she could see past the second property line, were Harleys. Some upright, most not, some reduced to components. All 71 people were on their feet. She counted them without being fully conscious that she was counting them. 71. Raven appeared beside her. He was favoring his left side from the shoulder, holding that arm slightly away from his body. His face was unchanged, the same unreadable steadiness he'd carried since he walked through the door, asking if they were open. "You saved 67 lives today," he said. She picked up the copper lantern sign. It was heavier than she expected, bent and wet from the rain that had come with the storm. She held it in both arms like something she did not know what to do with. Then losing the building was worth it, she said. She meant it. She stood among the ruins of every decision she'd made in 8 years and meant every word of it. Later, after the emergency vehicles arrived, after the volunteers from Red Willow came with water and blankets and useless, necessary presents, after the riders had accounted for each other, and Raven had refused treatment for his shoulder twice and accepted it. Once Megan walked around to the back of the foundation, where the remains of the kitchen walls formed a partial corner. She sat down on the concrete, and she let herself cry, not for the building, not for the money, for the way it felt to hold something for 8 years and feel it gone in 4 minutes, for the fact that somewhere in what used to be the kitchen, under what used to be the counter, was a recipe box with Danny's handwriting on the cards, for the particular shape of a loss that comes not from what you failed to protect, but from what you chose to protect instead. She cried, alone, quietly, the way she had always done the things she needed most to do. Nobody came around the corner. Nobody gave her that. Nobody except, at some point, the distant sound of motorcycles starting, one by one, a long, irregular sequence of engines catching and settling, and then, eventually, leaving. She listened to them go. She did not look up. She sat behind that broken wall for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she had counted. Not intentionally, her brain had simply started counting the way it always did when she needed to hold on to something concrete, something measurable, something that was not the image of the copper lantern sign, face down in the gravel, or the sound the roof had made when it left. 11 minutes. Then she stood up, brushed the concrete dust off her jeans, and went back to work, because there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The emergency responders had arrived while she was behind the wall, two county sheriff's deputies, a volunteer fire unit from Red Willow, and a paramedic van that had come from 20 miles east because the closer station was dealing with damage of its own. They had set up a loose triage area near the highway using the tailgate of one of the pickup trucks as a surface, and when Megan came around the corner, they looked at her the way people look at someone they expect to be in shock. She was not in shock. "I need a head count confirmed," she told the first deputy, a young man named Briggs, who had been 2 years behind her in school. 71 people were in that basement. "I need all 71 accounted for before anyone leaves this property." Briggs blinked. "Ma'am, are you?" "I'm fine." "Head count." He did the head count. 71. Every one of them standing, sitting, or being treated for minor injuries at the tailgate triage. Nobody had been taken by air. Nobody was missing. Megan let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 40 minutes and went to talk to the paramedic about Raven's shoulder. He was sitting on the wheel well of the fire unit's truck, still favoring his left side, still holding that arm at the precise angle of someone trying to convince himself it wasn't as bad as it was. The paramedic, a compact woman in her 40s named Andrea, was trying to get him to remove his cut so she could get a proper look. "It's not dislocated," he said. "Sir, I'm the one who determines I've dislocated it before. This is different. It's the AC joint." Andrea looked at Megan when she walked up, the look of someone asking for backup. "Grant," Megan said. He looked at her. The first time she'd used his given name. He noticed. "Let her look at it," she said. He took off the cut. The AC joint was, in fact, separated. Andrea confirmed it with a degree of professional satisfaction that Megan respected. Not dislocated, which would have required immediate reduction. Separated, which meant a sling, ice, and a follow-up with orthopedics in the next 48 hours. "I'll do the follow-up," he said, accepting the sling without argument. "When?" Andrea said. "When I'm done here." "You're done here," Megan said. "Your chapter needs to get to Missouri." He looked at her steadily. "We're not leaving you in this." "Yes, you are. The memorial is tomorrow. Eddie Callahan had 22 years in your chapter, and you are going to be at his memorial, and so is every one of your riders, because that is what you owe him." Something moved across his face. Not anger. Something older than anger. "You just lost everything," he said. "I lost a building." She said it levelly. "You're going to lose your chance to say goodbye to your brother if you stay here arguing with me." A long silence. "We're not leaving you with nothing," he said. "Then leave me something useful." She thought for 2 seconds. "Tell your people to help clear the road before they go. The debris on the highway shoulder is going to cause an accident by dark if someone doesn't move it." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he stood up, sling and all, and started giving instructions. The riders worked the shoulder for an hour and 40 minutes. They had no equipment, no heavy machinery, no proper tools. They had their hands, their belts, a come-along that someone found in a saddlebag, and the particular organized efficiency of people who were accustomed to solving mechanical problems in inconvenient locations. They moved lumber, sheet metal, shingles, the contents of her walk-in cooler, 2 of the dining room booth tables, the remains of the coffee station, and approximately 40 feet of electrical conduit that had come down from somewhere and was lying diagonally across the highway lane. Dylan Monroe Sparks did not work the shoulder. Megan noticed his absence and found him 40 minutes into the cleanup, crouched in the south drainage ditch on the far side of the property. His motorcycle was there, or most of it was there. The frame was intact. The tank was crumpled on one side. The front fork had separated from the frame at the triple clamp, which was a fixable injury, but not a small one. He was turning the handlebars over in his hands, slowly. The way you handle something, you are trying to understand whether you can save. She didn't say anything. She just crouched down next to him. 3 years, he said, not looking at her. "I know. I did the engine myself. The primary. Rebuilt the carburetor twice before I got the jetting right." He set the handlebars down. "My grandfather's watch was in the saddlebag." She went still. "I know it's just a watch," he said quickly, defensively. The way people get defensive about grief that they feel isn't serious enough to justify. It's just Dylan. It's not just anything. She looked at the motorcycle. That saddlebag leather or hard case? Leather. Then it's somewhere in that ditch or the field behind it. Leather bags don't go far, they catch air, but they're heavy. You want to look for it? He looked at her. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because there is nothing else I can accomplish on this property right now that matters more. She stood up. Come on. They searched the south field for 22 minutes. Megan found it the saddlebag, crumpled and wet, and 15 feet into the field, hung up on a fence post. The watch was inside it, wrapped in the same bandana it had apparently lived in for years. The glass cracked, but the mechanism intact. Dylan held it for a long time without saying anything. Thank you, he said finally. Thank your grandfather, she said. He apparently packed light. Something close to a laugh. Not quite, but close. It was Sparks who found the recipe box. Megan didn't know this until much later. She was dealing with the deputy and the insurance adjuster's preliminary call, and the first voicemail from Calvin Rourke. She didn't listen to it immediately. Just saw his name on the screen and felt something cold and specific settle in her chest when Sparks went back to the rubble of the kitchen alone. He found the recipe box under the collapsed counter, in the corner where the shelving unit had fallen against the wall at an angle that had, by pure structural accident, created a small protected space. The box itself was scorched on one side, and the lid had warped so it didn't close properly anymore. Most of the cards inside were damaged water, heat, the general violence of what the kitchen had been through. Some were completely illegible. Some had lost their bottom halves. One card was in different handwriting than the others. He didn't know whose handwriting it was. But the card was in the back, behind all the others, in the position of something saved rather than used, the position of something kept for reasons that had nothing to do with cooking. The water damage had taken most of it. There were fragments. A title at the top, 3 words, readable. The first 2 steps of whatever it described, partially readable. The rest gone. He took the box. He didn't tell Megan. He didn't tell Raven. He wrapped it in his jacket and put it in the saddlebag next to his grandfather's watch and climbed on his damaged motorcycle, which he had partially reassembled enough to run, though it sounded angry, and rejoined the convoy. He told himself he would figure out what to do with it later. Later would turn out to be 3 weeks and 2,000 miles, and a conversation he wasn't ready for yet. The convoy left at 4:17 in the afternoon. Megan stood at the edge of what used to be the parking lot and watched them go. 64 bikes, some damaged, some not. All of them running, pulling out in the organized sequence they'd arrived in. The road captain first. The road captain always first. Raven went past her without stopping. He looked at her through the open helmet, held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and nodded once. She nodded back, and then they were gone. The sound of the engines diminished east on the highway, and then the highway was empty, and the property was quiet in the particular way of places where something large has just happened, and the air hasn't settled back to normal yet. Tessa came and stood beside her. You okay? Tessa said. No, Megan said. Not even a little bit. Okay, Tessa put her hands in her pockets. What do we do first? Megan looked at what remained. The foundation. The basement, structurally intact. One exterior wall of the kitchen, the lower 4 feet of it. The walk-in cooler, somehow, miraculously, still sealed. The sign in the gravel. I need to call Leonard, she said. Your accountant. To find out exactly how bad the financial picture is before I call the bank. She paused. And I need to call Rachel. Tessa said nothing for a moment. Then she's going to say I told you so. She's going to try, Megan said. She won't finish the sentence. She was right. Rachel didn't finish the sentence. She drove from Topeka and arrived at 11:40 that night with a sleeping bag, a laptop, and a thermos of good coffee, and she sat on the foundation slab of the copper lantern under a clear Kansas sky and went through every number with her sister until 2 in the morning without once saying what she'd been right about. That was its own kind of love. Megan recognized it and was grateful for it and did not say so because that was the particular Language. The Hartwell sisters had always spoken the language of showing up instead of explaining. Calvin Rourke arrived at 7:45 the following morning. He came in a white pickup truck with his company logo on the door, Rourke Development, black lettering, the kind of clean professional presentation that was designed to communicate inevitability. He parked on the undamaged section of the lot, got out, and stood looking at the property with an expression Megan could only describe as controlled satisfaction, wearing a costume of concern. He was 53, silver-haired, the kind of man who had learned to perform sympathy convincingly enough that he occasionally fooled himself into believing it. Megan, he shook his head slowly, as if the destruction was something he personally mourned. Lord, what a thing. She was standing on the foundation slab with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. She had been awake since 5. She had been making lists. Calvin, you hear about the Reinhold farm? Lost both barns. Prentice lost his equipment shed. He kept shaking his head. This county is going to need a lot of help. What do you want? The concerned expression settled slightly. He was a man accustomed to building up to things. I came to see if you were all right. I'm fine. What do you want? He looked at the ruins for a moment longer. I want to make you a fair offer. You've got a foundation and a basement and 60 acres that flood every 3 years. I've got a freight depot project that can bring 40 jobs to this county. And I've got a number I think you'll find. Stop, she said it simply, not angrily. With the same tone she'd used on the bikers the day before, the tone of someone who has already finished the conversation in her head and found the answer. I'm not selling, Megan. I'm not selling today. I won't be selling next week. I understand your timeline and your project, and none of that changes what I just said. He shifted his weight. Your insurance doesn't cover full wind event damage. I've looked at the standard. How did you know what my insurance covers? A pause. Small, calibrated. It's standard practice in the county. Most policies exclude. Calvin, she looked at him directly. How did you know what my policy excludes? He recovered smoothly. He was good at recovering smoothly. I'm just saying that rebuilding is going to cost you more than you have. And I can give you a number today that lets you walk away with something instead of nothing. I already have something, she said. I have a basement that held 71 people through an EF3 tornado. I'm going to rebuild around it. She paused. Have a safe drive back. He stood there for a moment longer, and something shifted behind his eyes, not anger exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has hit an obstacle he hadn't fully anticipated. He nodded once, got back in the white truck, and left. Megan wrote one word on her legal pad, Rourke. Then she underlined it twice and kept writing. The bank gave her 30 days. The county inspector came on the 3rd day after the tornado, a methodical man named Hofstede, who spent 4 hours on the property and then told her that the basement, while structurally sound, could not be certified as safe for public use without professional reinforcement of the ceiling junction and the replacement of the stairwell. He gave her a written notice. The basement was off limits until further work was done. Without a functioning building, she couldn't serve food. Without serving food, she couldn't generate revenue. Without revenue, she couldn't make the bank payment. Without the bank payment, she would lose the land. And Calvin Rourke, who had somehow acquired an option on the neighboring parcel, would have everything he needed to move his freight depot forward regardless. She sat with this for 2 days. She went through it from every angle. She called Leonard, who confirmed the numbers with his usual dry precision, and then uncharacteristically said, Megan, I'm sorry. I don't have a solution, but I'm sorry. She called 3 contractors about the basement reinforcement. The lowest estimate was $19,000. The timeline was 6 to 8 weeks. She had 30 days. On the 4th night, she sat on the foundation slab alone. After Rachel had gone to bed, in the tent they'd set up on the property, because neither of them was willing to leave it unoccupied. And she looked at what remained and did the math one more time. The math didn't change. It had the same answer it always had, which was that she was going to lose the copper lantern unless something happened that she currently could not see. She thought about what Raven had said. You saved 67 lives today. She thought about what she had answered. And she had meant it when she said it. And she still meant it. She thought about the 64 motorcycles she had sent east on the highway. She thought about Sparks and his grandfather's watch and the close way he'd held it in the field. She thought about the chess game in the corner booth and the old rider with the reading glasses who had gone without being asked to the far corner with the lantern. She thought about Eddie Callahan, 59 years old, 22 years in his chapter, and the memorial happening right now in Kirby Flats, Missouri, and the man with the gray beard and the separated AC joint standing at the front of it. She did not let herself call. She had told them they owed her nothing, and she had meant that too. And she was not a person who said things she didn't mean. She just sat with the fact of it. The rumors started in the second week. She heard them first from Josie, who heard them at the gas station on Route 9, where a man she didn't know had told the cashier that the reason the roadhouse had been destroyed was because Megan had let a biker gang use it as a base and they'd done something to provoke the incident, which was not how tornadoes worked. But the man had said it with confidence, and the cashier had repeated it to Josie with the slightly breathless quality of someone passing along information they found credible. She heard them next from the owner of the Millbrook Farm Supply, who called to tell her apologetically that he wasn't going to be able to extend her the 60-day credit line she'd asked about for rebuilding materials. He said he was sorry. He said it was a business decision. He said it in the tone of a man who had been told something by someone with more leverage than her. She asked him directly, "Did Calvin Rourke talk to you?" A pause. "Megan, it's a yes or no question." "Dale, I've got to run my business," he said, and hung up. She called 3 other suppliers. 2 of them declined the same way. One of them, old Harold Meacham at Meacham Salvage, who had been doing business with her since she'd bought the property, didn't decline, but told her she needed to move carefully. "Rourke's been talking," Harold said, "saying the shelter you're proposing is going to bring transient traffic into the county, saying it's a liability, saying the bikers were using you and you just can't see it." He paused. "I'm telling you so you know, not so you'll change your plans." "I know," she said. "Thank you, Harold." She did not change her plans. But on the 14th day, she drove to the county commission meeting in Red Willow and stood up in front of 9 commissioners and a room of 70-odd constituents and proposed clearly and specifically that the Copper Lantern be rebuilt with a reinforced public storm shelter funded through a combination of insurance, private donation, and a county emergency infrastructure grant that she had found in the state code and that had never been applied for in this county. The room was not with her. It wasn't hostile. It was the kind of not with her that is harder to fight than hostility, the polite, settled, slightly pitying skepticism of people who have already decided that something is not going to happen. Commissioner Aldridge, who sat in the center of the panel and had represented the district for 19 years, said, "Ms. Hartwell, the commission appreciates your commitment to the community. However, the funding mechanism you're describing requires a match, and the county simply doesn't have." "I know the county doesn't have it," she said. "I'm saying I will raise the match. I'm asking the commission to apply for the state grant so that when I have the match, we can move. And where do you propose to raise?" "I'll figure that out," she said. Another kind of quiet, the kind where people are not sure whether to feel admiration or embarrassment on someone's behalf. "Hartwell," said a woman near the back, someone she didn't recognize, "you're proposing to rebuild a business that was already struggling financially and add a public shelter that will cost." "That shelter held 71 people alive through an EF3 tornado," Megan said. 26 miles of highway in this county have no public shelter between the state line and the county seat. The next person who gets caught on that road in a storm is not going to have a basement to go to. I'm proposing to fix that." She paused. "I'll start with my own hands if nobody else will help." Someone in the back actually laughed, not meanly, just the laugh of someone who finds a statement slightly too large to take seriously. Megan didn't react to the laugh. She looked at Commissioner Aldridge. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been in office long enough to recognize when he was looking at someone who was not going to stop. We'll take it under advisement, he said. She drove back to the property. She pulled up on the gravel lot at 8:45 that night, and Rachel was still awake, sitting in the camp chair outside the tent with her laptop open. How'd it go? Rachel said. Megan got out of the truck. She stood for a moment looking at the foundation, the concrete, the intact basement door, the clear sky with the stars coming through. They laughed, she said. Rachel looked at her. And I'm going to start clearing debris tomorrow morning. She paused. Want to help? Rachel closed the laptop. I already set my alarm, she said. She was up at 5:15. She made coffee on the camp stove, poured it into the thermos, and walked out to the foundation in the dark. The debris field was extensive, she'd known that. But knowing it and standing in front of it at 5 in the morning with a pair of work gloves and no equipment were two different experiences. There were things in that debris that she could move by hand and things she could not move without machinery. And the machinery she didn't have the money to rent. She started with what she could move. She worked in silence, alone as the sky lightened. She carried lumber. She sorted salvageable materials from waste. She found, under a pile of collapsed shelving, the cast iron skillet she had cooked on every morning for 7 years, her mother's skillet, brought from the house in Wichita after her mother died. It was intact. She set it aside carefully, as if it were something that could still break. She found a booth seat, the green vinyl one, from the table by the window where the two chess-playing writers had sat. She found half of the chalkboard menu she'd written on every Tuesday. She found, remarkably, the laminated card with the 3 rules, face down in a crack between 2 sections of foundation slab. She picked it up. The lamination had protected it. Don't steal. Don't disrespect Tessa. Pay what you can. She propped it against the cast iron skillet and kept working. By 7 in the morning, she had cleared a 12 by 8 section of the foundation. It was not much. It was also the most progress she had made on anything in 2 weeks. And she understood standing there with sweat on her face and concrete dust on her jeans. That progress of any scale was what she had. So she took it. She did not hear the sound at first because her back was to the highway and she was focused on a section of collapsed shelving. She heard it when it was already close. A vibration. Low and continuous. The kind that comes through the ground before it comes through the air. She straightened up, turned around, and saw the headlights. Not one set. Not 5. A line of headlights on the highway, stretching back into the early morning dark, coming from the west. More of them than she could count, and the sound resolving now into what it was, what it unmistakably was, and it kept growing. More lights, more sound. The highway filling up with something enormous and organized and headed directly toward her. She stood very still. 300 Harleys turned off the highway and surrounded the ruins of the copper lantern. She did not move. She did not speak. She stood among the broken walls of everything she had built and watched them come, and she felt something happen in her chest that she was not immediately able to name, not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly. Something larger than both and older than either. Something that had to do with the specific experience of learning. After years of taking care of other people alone, that someone had decided to take care of you back. Raven dismounted first. He walked toward her across the gravel and stopped 3 feet away. And he looked at her the way he had looked at the building the first time, with that complete, assessing steadiness. And then he said, "You protected our brothers when they had nowhere to go." He paused. "Now step aside and let your brothers work." She looked at him. At the 300 bikes surrounding her property. At the riders already dismounting, already moving toward the debris field with the specific, purposeful efficiency she had watched them turn on the highway shoulder 3 weeks ago. She felt herself starting to respond, the automatic, reflexive response she had spent 8 years developing. The "I'm fine, I've got this, I don't need," and she stopped it. "One condition," she said. He waited. "The shelter stays open during any severe weather warning. Anyone. Customers, truckers, people who can't pay, people traveling through, people with nowhere else to go." She paused. "Anyone who needs it gets in." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, That was already the plan. And the copper lantern began to rise again. They moved like they had a plan because they did. Raven hadn't shown up with 300 riders and a good intention. He'd shown up with a list. Megan saw it in the first 10 minutes, the way the convoy broke apart without being told, the way clusters of men moved towards specific sections of the debris field, the way a heavy-set rider she didn't recognize started directing traffic in the parking lot with the calm authority of someone who directed traffic for a living and probably did. She found out later his name was Carver, that he ran logistics for a transport company in Tulsa, and that he had driven 11 hours through the night to be here by 7 in the morning. 11 hours through the night for a woman he had never met. She stood and watched for approximately 90 seconds before a short, broad-shouldered man in his 50s appeared at her elbow and said, "Miss Hartwell, my name is Frank Delgado. I'm a structural engineer, retired. Grant asked me to come look at your basement reinforcement before we start framing. Can you walk me down?" She looked at him. "You're a structural engineer." 31 years, he said it without pride, just fact. "I did the Rourke overpass outside Salina, the county bridge on Route 12. Before that, flood barrier work in Louisiana. You know Calvin Rourke?" Something moved across his face. "I built things for him. That's different from knowing him." He nodded toward the basement door. "Can we go down?" They went down. Frank Delgado spent 40 minutes in the basement with a flashlight, a tape measure, and a small notebook in which he made drawings with the practiced shorthand of someone who thought spatially and wrote in compression. He tapped walls. He checked the ceiling junction where Hofstede had flagged the reinforcement requirement. He examined the stairwell brace that had nearly failed during the tornado, the one that Raven and 2 others had held with their bodies while the building came apart above them. He came back up the stairs and said, "Standard reinforcement. This basement would hold through an EF4. What you need is a new stairwell structure and 16 feet of ceiling junction rebar embedded in concrete. I can have drawings done by this afternoon." "Your county inspector Hofstede?" "Yes, I know Hofstede. He's thorough. He'll accept properly stamped drawings." He paused. "I'll have them stamped before I leave." Megan looked at him for a long moment. "Frank, what do you charge for this?" "Nothing," he said. "That's not Miss Hartwell." He held up a hand, not unkindly. "My son was in that basement." She went still. "Younger one, 28. He rides with the Springfield chapter." He put the notebook in his shirt pocket. "He called me from Missouri after the memorial. He said that a woman outside Red Willow had put herself between his chapter and a tornado and told them she'd die before she let them walk out into it." He paused. "I've been doing structural work for 40 years. This is the first time I've ever had a reason for it that was worth a damn." He walked back toward the debris field before she could respond, which was probably, she thought, intentional. By 9 o'clock, the property looked like a construction site instead of a disaster site, which was a distinction that mattered more than it might seem from the outside. A disaster site is something that happened to you. A construction site is something you are doing. The difference was in the movement, the direction of it, the purposefulness of it, and Megan felt that difference somewhere in her chest as she watched it happen around her. Tessa arrived at 9:15 with her truck, her tools, and a folding table that she set up near the foundation and immediately converted into a coordination station. She had a clipboard. Tessa always had a clipboard when things needed organizing, and within 20 minutes, she had the entire project sorted into work streams, the riders divided by skill into crews, and a running list of materials needed that she was cross-referencing against what had been salvaged from the debris. "Where did you get the lumber?" Megan asked her, looking at the growing stack of framing material near the east wall. "3 farms, Tessa said, without looking up the clipboard. "Reinholtz, Beckett's, and old Wayne Sutter out on 9. Wayne called me this morning at 6 and said he had materials and did we need them. I said yes before he finished the sentence. How did Wayne know we were rebuilding today?" Tessa looked up. "Megan, 300 motorcycles came through Red Willow at 6:30 in the morning. Wayne knew by 6:32. "Fair enough. Rachel was at the folding table with her laptop, which she had connected to a portable hotspot, and she was doing something with financial records that involved a great deal of focused typing and occasional, very quiet profanity. Megan went to her. "Talk to me," Megan said. Rachel looked up. Her eyes were slightly red, which meant she had been awake before 5 and probably hadn't slept well before that either. "The insurance claim is going to pay out 40% of the reconstruction estimate. Not enough, but not nothing. The county grant, the one you cited at the commission meeting, I pulled the actual state code. You're right that it exists, and right that it's never been applied for in this county. If the commission agrees to submit, the match requirement is 30% private funding. And we have 12%, Rachel said, from the insurance and what's left in the operating account." She paused. "We need another 18%. How much is that in dollars?" $31,400. Megan was quiet for a moment. "What about the donations?" $420 in the jar that Tessa put out yesterday." Rachel said it without inflection, which was the kindest way to say it, and a check for $2,000 from Harold Meacham. Good Harold. She'd thank him properly. "So we're short $29,000, Megan said. "Yes. And the banknote needs to be current in 16 days. Megan looked at the construction happening around her. 300 people, organized and purposeful, building something that needed to be built. The labor, the skilled labor alone, would have cost her more than the grant required if she'd had to pay for it. She just needed the money. "I'm going to the county commission," she said. "Again." Rachel blinked. "They tabled it 2 weeks ago. They tabled the proposal when I was alone, and the shelter was theoretical." She gestured at the construction. "It's not theoretical now, and I'm not alone." She drove to the county seat at 11. She did not have an appointment. She walked into Commissioner Aldridge's office and told his assistant she would wait. And she waited for 47 minutes in a plastic chair in the hallway, reading a 6-month-old copy of a farming trade magazine. And then the door opened, and Aldridge looked at her with the expression of a man who had hoped she wouldn't still be there. "Miss Hartwell." "Commissioner." She stood up. "I need 10 minutes." He gave her 20. She told him about Frank Delgado and the stamped drawings, which would remove the county's liability exposure on the basement certification. She told him about the material donations from 3 local farms, which demonstrated community investment. She told him about the 300 skilled volunteers currently on the property, which demonstrated organized capacity. She put Rachel's numbers on the desk: the insurance payout, the donation figure, the gap. $31,000, she said. "That's what the private match requires. If the county submits the state grant application and the commission endorses it, I believe I can raise that number." Aldridge looked at the numbers. He had a politician's relationship with numbers. He could read them quickly, and he understood what they meant for him, not just for her. "The commission meeting is Thursday. Today is Tuesday. I understand what day it is, Miss Hartwell." "Commissioner, there are 300 volunteers on my property right now. They're going to be there tomorrow and the day after that. They came from 8 different states. That's a story that's going to be told regardless of what the commission does." She paused. "I'm asking you to be part of the right version of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll make some calls," he said. She drove back to the property. The first sabotage happened that night. She was asleep in the tent, genuinely asleep. For the first time in weeks, the deep, unconscious sleep of physical exhaustion when a sound brought her partway up. Not a dramatic sound. Not breaking glass or an engine or anything that announced itself. A scraping, dragging sound, irregular and low. She was awake enough to hear it, and not awake enough to place it, and then she was asleep again. She found the damage in the morning. The framing for the new east wall, 2 days of careful work, properly squared and braced, waiting for the concrete crew to come pour. The footings had been partially dismantled. Not destroyed. Dismantled, which was more deliberate. Several key braces had been pulled, the anchor hardware removed and taken, and 2 sections of the frame had been tipped so that when the concrete was poured, it would set wrong and everything above it would be off plumb. It looked at first glance like a structural mistake. which was the point. Megan looked at it for a long moment and then turned to find Raven already standing beside her. "When?" he said. "Sometime after midnight. I heard something around 2, but didn't place it." He walked the perimeter of the damaged framing slowly, hands in his pockets. "This isn't random," he said. "Someone who knew what they were doing came in here and made a specific change in a specific place." "Someone who knew construction," she agreed. "How many people know this site?" "Everyone in the county." She paused. "And everyone Rourke talks to." Raven looked at her. "Don't say it yet," he said. "Saying it and proving it are different." "I know. Do you have any cameras?" She had 2 cheap wireless cameras she'd bought 2 years ago for the roadhouse and never installed because she'd never gotten around to it. They were in the storage unit in Red Willow. Rachel had them within the hour. A writer named Gomez, who turned out to work in network security in Albuquerque, had them operational and positioned before noon. Nobody said anything about it to anyone outside the core group. But the second sabotage happened anyway, 3 nights later. This time it was worse. The underground water line, a buried PVC run that fed the kitchen, had been deliberately cut and partially removed. Not broken, cut clean with a tool. When the concrete crew arrived that morning and turned the supply on to test the plumbing before pouring, water flooded the entire east foundation section and set the timeline back by 4 days while they dried it and rerouted. The concrete crew was furious. One of them, a thick-armed man from Wichita who had driven out on his day off specifically to help, walked up to Megan and said, "This wasn't an accident. Somebody cut that line." "I know," she said. "Then why aren't you?" "Because I'm going to handle it correctly," she said it quietly. "If I handle it wrong, I lose. If I handle it right, he loses. And I want him to lose." The man looked at her. He looked at Raven, who was standing 5 feet away with the same expression he always wore, the one that gave nothing away. He nodded slowly. He said, "We'll be back." He was. The county commission met on Thursday. By then, the rumor in Red Willow had shifted. The original story, the one Rourke had been quietly circulating about bikers using Megan as cover for something unsavory, had run into the visible, daily, impossible to ignore counter-narrative of 300 people rebuilding a roadhouse with their hands. People drove past the property on their way to town. They saw it. They saw farmers delivering lumber. They saw Tessa's coordination table. They saw Frank Delgado in his hard hat reviewing drawings with the county inspector. They saw most visibly the riders themselves working, not loitering, not threatening, working. And the story that Rourke had tried to plant began to lose its purchase on the available facts. By Thursday morning, 42 Red Willow residents had signed a letter of support for the storm shelter project. Aldridge had it on his desk when the meeting started. He also had a call from the state infrastructure office, which Megan had made on Wednesday afternoon, and which had confirmed that the emergency shelter grant program was active, underfunded in this county, and available if the commission submitted the application. She sat in the back of the commission chambers and waited. The vote was 6-3. She called Rachel from the parking lot. "They approved the application," she said. Rachel was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Then how much?" "Pending grant approval. The state covers 62%. We need to raise 38% private match." She paused. "Which is more than what we discussed." "How much more?" She said the number. Rachel was quiet again. "Longer this time." "Okay," Rachel said finally. "Okay. I'll figure out the numbers. You focus on the build." Megan." Her voice was steady and dry in the way it got when she was holding something firmly that she didn't want to drop. 8 years ago, you sorted through those bills alone. You don't have to do this alone. Let me do the numbers." Megan stood in the county parking lot in the afternoon heat and held the phone and did not say what she felt, because she and Rachel had never been people who said those things. "Set your alarm," she said. "Already did," Rachel said. The camera footage came back 4 days after the second sabotage. Gomez had reviewed it himself first, which she appreciated because it meant that by the time she sat down with Raven and Rachel at the camp table to watch it, he had already cut the relevant sections, and she didn't have to sit through 6 hours of empty parking lot. He pulled it up on his laptop and pressed play. The man who came onto the property at 2:14 in the morning was not someone she knew by name immediately. He was wearing dark clothing and a ball cap pulled down, but he moved with purpose and confidence in the unfamiliar space, which meant he had been here before. He knew exactly where the water line was. He knew where the framing sections connected. He worked without a light, which meant he had either memorized the layout or been given very specific instructions. He also drove a white work truck with a partial company logo visible on the door. Megan looked at the logo for a long time. "That's a Rourke development vehicle," she said. Nobody disputed it. "That's his foreman," Rachel said. She had pulled up Rourke Development's company page on her laptop while Gomez was still setting up. She turned the screen, a headshot, a name, a title. "His name is Brett Holloway. He manages all Rourke's construction sites in the county." Raven said nothing for a moment. He looked at the footage, and he looked at the headshot, and he bet both down and looked at the middle distance the way he did when he was working through something carefully. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Megan had thought about this moment. She had thought about it in the abstract since the first morning she found the framing dismantled. And she had been clear in her own mind about the answer since before the camera footage confirmed anything. "I want to do it right," she said. Police report. County Attorney's Office. "I want every piece of documentation we have, the footage, the supply records showing what was taken, the contractor's estimate on the water line repair, the timeline. I want it all in a file, and I want it delivered to the county attorney by end of business tomorrow." Raven looked at her. "That's it?" "No, that's it," she said it firmly. "Rourke wants to make this about who we are. About bikers and a woman who can't take care of herself. If we go at him the way he expects us to, we prove his story for him." She paused. "We go at him the way the law allows us to, we prove ours." Raven held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not agreement exactly, but something that recognized a kind of thinking he respected. "All right," he said. "Who do you know at the county attorney's office?" "Nobody," she said. "But Rachel does." Rachel looked up from her laptop. "I went to law school with someone who clerked there," she said. "I'll make the call." The call was made. The file was delivered. The county attorney's office opened an inquiry into Brett Holloway and, by extension, into Rourke Development's conduct toward the Copper Lantern property. Within 48 hours, Rourke's land option on the neighboring parcel was suspended pending the investigation. He called Megan that evening. She did not answer. She let it go to voicemail, listened to the message. Once his voice was smooth and professional, and she could hear the specific, careful quality of a man who knew he might be recorded, and forwarded it to Rachel, who forwarded it to the county attorney. She did not call him back. What she didn't anticipate was the town, not the commission's vote, which she had worked for and half expected. The town itself. The actual people of Red Willow, who she had lived near for 8 years and not quite connected to. Not the way she'd connected to the travelers and the truckers and the stranded strangers who passed through. It started with Wayne Sutter's lumber. Then a woman named Denise Copeland, who ran the hardware store on Main Street, showed up one morning with a truck full of electrical supplies and said her supplier had donated them when he heard the story. Denise had told him the story. She had been telling it to anyone who would listen, apparently. Then the elementary school sent 30 pounds of cookies, with a hand-painted card signed by every student in 2nd grade. Then the Methodist Church organized a food rotation so the construction crew had meals without Megan having to think about it. This was handled by a retired woman named Patty Gerhard, who had opinions about casseroles and implemented them with military efficiency. Then 2 families who had evacuated during the tornado, families whose farms were east of the property, and who had gotten to shelter because they'd heard the weather radio from the Copper Lantern's parking lot as they drove past. Those 2 families came to the property with their adult children and worked every weekend for 3 weeks without being asked. Megan watched this happen and did not fully know what to do with it. She had spent 8 years being a place where strangers came to be taken care of. She did not have a well-developed system for being taken care of herself. The receiving was harder than the giving it, required a different kind of courage, a willingness to accept help without immediately converting it into something you could repay. And she worked at that willingness deliberately, consciously, the way she worked at anything that didn't come naturally. One evening, after the crew had gone, and she and Raven were the last two on the property, a pattern that had developed without being discussed. The way patterns between two people sometimes do, she said to him. Why do they keep coming back? He was checking the generator they'd installed for the shelter. He looked up. The riders, all of them. The riders, the town, the families. She paused. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I had a basement. I told people to use it. He straightened up. Megan, I mean it. I keep hearing people talk about it like it was some kind of you stood in front of 64 men twice your size in the middle of a tornado warning and told them they weren't leaving. His voice was level. Most people faced with that would have gotten out of the way. I wasn't going to get out of the way. I know. He looked at her. That's why they keep coming back. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the Kansas evening was settling in the way it did in late summer slowly, with the particular quality of light that made everything look slightly more significant than it had during the day. How's the shoulder? She said. Fixed, he said, which she knew was not entirely accurate because she had seen him favor it on cold mornings. But she also knew it was the truest answer he was going to give. The memorial, she said. How was it? A pause. Long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped. It was what those things are, he said. People saying true things about someone who isn't there to correct them. He paused. Eddie would have hated half of it and loved the other half. Which half would he have loved? The part where they played his playlist on the lot afterward, and everyone danced badly. A ghost of something crossed his face. Eddie loved seeing people make fools of themselves. He considered it a spiritual experience. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden and genuine. He looked at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen there before. Not the assessing steadiness, not the authority. Something quieter than both of those. He looked away before she could identify it precisely. 4 days, he said, going back to the generator. The shelter should be ready to certify in 4 days. Frank thinks so too, she said. Frank's usually right. He paused. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. Neither do you. She thought. She didn't say it. She went back inside. It was on the 20th day that Brett Holloway confessed. Not voluntarily. The county attorney's investigator had reached him through a combination of the camera footage, a record of Rourke Development's supply purchases that matched the hardware taken from the construction site, and the testimony of another Rourke employee who had been present when Holloway received his instructions. The instruction, apparently, had been to slow the rebuild by any means that couldn't be directly traced to Rourke himself. Holloway had followed it. He had done so because he had been with Rourke Development for 11 years, and because Rourke had told him it was a negotiating tactic and that no one would be seriously harmed. He'd told this to the investigator with the specific defeated quality of a man who understood, too late, that he had been the one taking the risk while someone else held the position of plausible deniability. Rourke's land option was formally revoked. A civil investigation was opened into his development practices. 2 other property owners in the county, people who had sold to Rourke under what they now believed were false or coercive circumstances, contacted the attorney's office within a week of the investigation becoming public. Megan heard all of this from Rachel, who heard it from her law school connection, who had started calling with updates with increasing frequency as the story grew. He's not going to be charged with anything criminal, Rachel told her. Not immediately. The sabotage exposure is on Holloway, not him. But the civil investigation is real, and the land option is gone, and his freight depot project is on hold indefinitely. Is that enough? Megan said. For now, Rachel said. The rest depends on what the other property owners bring. She paused. Megan, you stopped him from taking this property, and you exposed what he was doing to other people. That's not nothing. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I just keep thinking about the next person. The next place he tries to do this to. The next person has a public record to point to now, Rachel said. That matters. It did matter. She knew it mattered. She sat with that. The way she'd been learning to sit with things that were incomplete, not resolved the way she wanted them resolved, but moved in the direction that mattered. On the 21st day, she went back to the basement door and stood in front of it. The new stairwell was in. Frank Delgado's drawings had been executed to the millimeter. The ceiling junction was reinforced with 16 feet of rebar in poured concrete. The walls had been extended, and the square footage increased. The new capacity marked clearly on a sign that Tessa had ordered and that had arrived, inexplicably, in a font that matched the original copper lantern branding. She went down the stairs. The space was larger than it had been. It smelled of new concrete and sawdust, and the particular clean mineral smell of a room that had been properly sealed. The emergency lanterns were mounted in the same positions she'd always kept them. She'd been specific about that. The medical cabinet was new, larger, stocked. The ventilation system was improved. Along the east wall was a row of brackets, where in the next 48 hours, weather radios and charging stations and a first aid station would be installed. The west wall was bare concrete, poured and cured and waiting. She put her hand on it. In 2 days, 64 names would be engraved in that wall. And beneath them, 4 words she had not chosen herself but had been told about this morning when a writer named Simmons, who turned out to be a graphic designer from Denver, had shown her the sketch. No one faces the storm alone. She stood in the basement she had rebuilt, around the basement that had held, and she thought about the night 8 years ago when she had sat at the table in the duplex on Millbrook Drive and sorted through the bills alone while a state trooper's car backed out of the driveway. She thought about how she had told herself then that she would figure out what came next, that she always figured out what came next. She had been right. She had always been right about that. She just hadn't known, until now, that figuring out what came next didn't always mean doing it alone. She climbed the stairs. The Kansas sky above the property was clear and wide, and the construction was nearly finished, and 300 Harleys were parked in clean rows along the highway. And somewhere on the folding table near the east wall, under a copy of Frank Delgado's stamped drawings and Rachel's financial spreadsheet, and Tessa's crew coordination clipboard, was a small scorched recipe box that hadn't come back yet. She didn't know about the box. Not yet. The 22nd day started the same way the previous 21 had Megan up before 5. Coffee on the camp stove. The sound of Kansas waking up around a property that was slowly, stubbornly becoming something again. But the 22nd day was different in one specific way that she didn't know about yet. Dylan Monroe had driven through the night. He'd left Springfield at 11 the previous evening, which meant he'd been on the road for 6 hours by the time he turned off the highway onto the Copper Lantern property at 5:12 in the morning and cut his engine in the dark so as not to wake anyone. He sat on his bike for a moment, the bike that he had spent 3 weeks repairing in a borrowed garage space in Missouri, working nights after the memorial duties were done, sourcing parts through a network of contacts who had heard what happened and delivered things faster than they should have been deliverable. The front fork was new. The tank had been straightened and repainted by a man in Joplin, who did bodywork and had refused payment twice before Dylan stopped offering. The engine sounded exactly the way it had before the tornado, which was the way it had sounded the first time he'd gotten the carburetor jetting right. At 2 in the morning in his grandmother's driveway, with her porch light on because she always left it on when he was working late, he sat on the bike in the dark with the scorched recipe box wrapped in his jacket and thought about what he was going to say. He hadn't figured it out by the time Megan came around the corner of the foundation with her coffee and stopped. They looked at each other across the gravel in the early dark. "You drove through the night," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why didn't you tell someone you were coming?" He looked down at the wrap jacket in his hands. "Because I didn't know how to explain this in a text message." She crossed the gravel. She sat down on the low section of the new east wall, the wall that had been sabotaged twice and rebuilt twice and was now solid and level and exactly what it was supposed to be. And she looked at him, and he held out the jacket. She took it. unwrapped it. She went very still. The recipe box was exactly as he'd found it, scorched on one side, the lid warped, the damage of fire and water on every surface. She held it with both hands and did not open it immediately. She just held it. I found it under the counter, he said, the day of the storm, before we left. I didn't tell you because I didn't know what I had yet, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. He paused. I know that was wrong. Taking something that wasn't mine without asking. Dylan, I want to explain it right, he said. Because what I was thinking was, he stopped, started again. I saw the way you ran that kitchen. The way you knew where everything was without looking. The way you talked about the biscuits like they meant something specific. And then when the storm hit and we were down there and everything was, he stopped again. I just didn't want it to be gone. Whatever was in that box. I didn't want it to disappear with everything else. Megan opened the box. She went through the cards slowly. Most of them were damaged the way he'd told her, water on the bottom halves, heat on the edges, some completely illegible. She touched each one with the careful attention of someone reading Braille, recognizing things by the shape of their damage. Her mother's pie crust, Danny's sister's cornbread, a chili recipe from a ranch hand who had eaten at the Copper Lantern every Tuesday for 3 years until he moved to New Mexico. She touched these things and did not say anything. Then she reached the back of the box. She found the card in the different handwriting, and she still eating a different way than she'd gone still before. Her hands stopped moving. Her face changed, not dramatically, not the way faces change in movies, but in the small specific way of someone who has been braced for a long time and has just been permitted to stop. Most of it's gone, Dylan said quickly. The bottom half. I'm sorry I looked at it because I thought maybe someone could. I thought maybe there was a way to. It's his handwriting, she said. He didn't say anything. The title and the first 2 steps. She was reading it the way you read something you have memorized and are checking your memory against. It's enough. She looked up. Where this card was in the back, behind the others, that's where I put things I'm not ready to use yet. She paused. I've had this card for 8 years. I've never cooked it. I just needed to know it was there. Dylan Monroe, 23 years old, who had ridden with the Hells Angels for 2 years and worked on engines since he was 16 and had not cried at his grandmother's funeral because he'd held it together for his mother, looked away from her and pressed his thumb hard against the side of his jaw. Okay, he said roughly. Thank you, she said, for bringing it back. He nodded. He couldn't say anything right then. You hungry? She said. Yes, ma'am. Camp stove's around the corner. Coffee's already made. I'll get eggs started in about 20 minutes when Rachel wakes up and stops complaining about the hour. He laughed short, real, the laugh of someone who needed it. She took the recipe box with her when she went. The 23rd day was when the town came. Not the organized, practical help of Tessa's crew lists or the commission's grant process or Rachel's numbers. The town itself, the actual unregimented, voluntary, showing up kind of town that Megan had served for 8 years and never quite believed was watching. It started with Patty Gerhard, who arrived at 7 with 2 casseroles and a folding cart and told Tessa she was taking over the food coordination because Tessa was needed elsewhere and someone had to manage the feeding. Tessa, who had been managing the feeding with perfect competence, looked at Megan. Megan looked at Patty. Patty stood with the cart and the casseroles and the expression of a woman who had made her decision. Let her, Megan said. Tessa stepped aside. Patty set up operations with the speed of someone who had been organizing church functions for 40 years and had streamlined the process to its essential mechanics. Within an hour, she had a feeding schedule that could handle 60 people in 30-minute rotations and had drafted 3 local women who had arrived with dishes into a functional kitchen rotation. Then the high school showed up. Not officially, not organized. 8 kids from the Red Willow High School FFA chapter arrived in 2 trucks, told Raven they were there to work, and were immediately assigned to the lumber sorting crew, which they joined without complaint and with the specific determined quality of teenagers who have chosen to be somewhere and intend to prove they belong there. Their teacher, a sunburned man named Mr. Daniels, who coached football in the fall and agricultural science in the spring, arrived 20 minutes later, looked at his students already working, and picked up a hammer without talking to anyone. Then the Reinhold family came. Then the Becketts. Then two more families, whose names Megan didn't know, but whose trucks she recognized from the county, who parked and worked without introduction. By 10 in the morning, there were 140 people on the property. Raven found her standing at the edge of it, watching. "You knew this would happen," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said honestly. "I hoped it. There's a difference." He stood beside her. They watched a 16-year-old from the FFA chapter take instruction from a 50-year-old Hells Angels rider on how to properly drive a framing nail, and both of them do it with complete seriousness, as if this were the most natural pairing in the world. 8 years, she said, almost to herself. "What about them? 8 years I've been feeding people here. I didn't know they were paying attention." "They were paying attention," he said. "That's why they're here." She thought about that, about the specific arithmetic of care, the way it accumulates invisibly for years, and then returns in a form you didn't expect and didn't know how to ask for. About how you could spend years doing something right and not know it had taken root until the moment you needed it most, and it came back to you in the form of casseroles and lumber and 16-year-olds with hammers. "Raven," she said, "yeah. What happens when you leave?" He looked at her. Not with surprise, she had asked the question the way she always asked important things, directly and without preamble. "I've been thinking about that," he said. And I think the answer is that I come back." She let that sit for a moment. She did not rush to respond to it, which was itself a kind of answer. "Kansas is a long way from wherever you're based," she said. "Kansas is on the highway," he said. "Everything I do is on the highway." She looked at him. The morning light was on his face, and his shoulder had been out of the sling for a week, and he was watching the construction with the same steady attentiveness he brought to everything, not performing care, just exercising it, the way certain people do everything, as if attention were the fundamental courtesy. "Okay," she said. He nodded, and they went back to work. The shelter certification happened on the 24th day. Hofstede arrived at 9 sharp with his clipboard and his methodical thoroughness and spent 3 hours examining every element Frank Delgado had specified. He checked the rebar embedment with a device Megan didn't know the name of. He measured the stairwell clearances. He tested the ventilation system, the emergency lighting, the medical cabinet mounting, the exit width. He counted the emergency weather radios, 4 of them, mounted at intervals, and checked that they were functional. He verified the capacity marking, the designated emergency contact posting, the posted storm protocol that Tessa had laminated and mounted at the top of the stairs. He came up from the basement and wrote in his clipboard for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at Megan. "The Rourke report from 2019, he said. "The one that said your original basement was marginal for public use." "Yes," she said carefully. "I wrote that report." He said it without apology, but with the specific weight of a man acknowledging something he had carried. "I stand behind the findings. Your original basement was marginal. But I want you to know that I have certified shelter spaces in this county for 23 years. And what I just walked through is the most complete public emergency space I have ever certified." He paused. "Whoever designed it knew what they were doing." "His name is Frank Delgado," she said. "I know Frank Delgado." A small nod. "Good engineer." "Good man." He signed the certification form. He gave her the copy. He shook her hand with the firm, brief grip of someone who did not make a performance of handshakes, and he got in his truck. Megan held the certification form and looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked to where Rachel was sitting at the folding table and put it down in front of her. Rachel looked at it, picked it up, read it carefully, the way Rachel read everything, set it back down. "That's the last piece," Rachel said. "The grant application is complete. Insurance payout is confirmed. Private match is," she checked her screen, "at 94%. We're $600 short of the match threshold." "We have $600 in the donation jar," Tessa said, from behind them. They both turned. Tessa was standing with the mason from the table near the entrance, the one she'd set up on day one and that Megan had not thought much about since. She set it on the table. It was full. Not of bills, mostly of bills, but also of folded notes and business cards and one envelope with a Kansas City postmark that Rachel opened and found contained a check for $200 and a note that said only, "I heard about the basement on the truck radio. Thank you for having the door open. Keep it open." It was signed with a first name only, Larry. Rachel looked at the total, looked up. We're at 104% of the match. The three of them stood around the folding table for a moment. "Okay," Megan said. That was all she said. But Tessa, who had known her for 5 years, heard everything that was behind it. She picked up the mason jar and set it back in its place. The engraving happened that evening. Simmons, the graphic designer from Denver, who had designed the No One Faces, the Storm Alone text, had brought the equipment himself. A rotary engraving tool and a set of templates he'd prepared in Missouri, and he worked the west wall of the basement with the precise, unhurried attention of someone doing something they understood was permanent. The 64 names went in first. Road names, not given names, because that was how the writers had requested it, and because those were, in the context of this story, the names that mattered. Raven, Sparks, Carver, Gomez, and 60 more in 3 columns. The spacing even, the depth consistent. Below them, centered in larger letters, No One Faces the Storm Alone. Megan stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched it happen. Raven stood beside her. Several of the original 64 were there, the ones who had stayed for the full build, and the ones who had returned for the end of it. Nobody spoke much. The sound of the engraving tool was the only sound for a long time. When it was done, Simmons stepped back. Megan walked forward and put her hand on the wall, the way she had the night she'd stood here alone before the names were there. She pressed her palm flat against the concrete beside the last line. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned around. "I need to say something," she said. The basement had maybe 20 people in it. She looked at each of them: Raven, Dylan, Simmons, Carver, Gomez, Frank Delgado, who had come back for the certification, Tessa, Rachel, old Wayne Sutter, who had driven in from his farm to see the finish. She looked at each of them the way she did everything directly, without performance. "I have been taking care of people in this building for 8 years, she said, "and I have never once asked for help. Not because I didn't need it, because I didn't know how." She paused. "I know how now. I know what it looks like when people decide that someone else's fight is their fight, too. And I want you to know, I want all of you to know that I understand what it cost you to be here. The hours and the miles and the nights and the work. I understand it." She stopped. "And I'm going to spend the rest of whatever time I have in this building making sure that every single person who needs a door open finds one. Because that's what you showed me is possible." Nobody applauded. It wasn't that kind of moment. But something moved through the room, that collective shift that happens when people have heard something they recognize as true and feel it land. Raven said that was already the plan, which was exactly what he'd said on the first morning, and which made Tessa laugh first and then everyone else. And the laugh broke whatever solemnity had been building and replaced it with something lighter and better. The reopening was supposed to be quiet. Megan had specifically said quiet. She had said it to Tessa, who had written it on her clipboard and nodded, with the expression of someone who would try but had reservations. She had said it to Rachel, who had said define quiet, and then, when Megan defined it, had said I'll see what I can do. She had not said it to Raven, because by the time the question came up, he had already left back on the road. Chapter commitments, the particular orbital existence of someone whose life moved rather than stayed. He had told her he would be back. She had said, okay. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. And she had meant it when she said it was enough. The morning of the reopening, she was up at 4. She made coffee on the now functional kitchen camp stove. Her stove, her actual commercial kitchen stove, had been delivered and installed on day 19, a Viking 6-burner that she absolutely could not afford, which had arrived on a freight truck from a supplier in Wichita with a bill that said 0 and a note that said community pricing. Don't ask. She had not asked. She was learning not to ask. She made biscuits. She made them from memory, from the hand knowledge of 8 years, of every morning repetition. And she made enough for 60 people because she was a person who cooked for the number she thought might arrive, plus a contingency, and 60 felt right. She thought maybe 30 people would come for the opening, maybe 40. The county had been invited through the commission's announcement. The trucking community had been notified through the radio networks. Tessa had put a post on the Roadhouse's social accounts. At 5:30, she heard the first vibration. She was pulling the third tray of biscuits from the oven. She felt it through the floor before she heard it, that specific frequency, the one that her body now recognized the way a mother recognizes a particular cry. She put the tray on the rack and went to the front door. The highway was full, not full in the way of traffic, full in the way of 300 motorcycles running two abreast from as far east as she could see to the first curve west, their headlights burning in the early dark, engine note rising as they came off the highway and turned into the lot. She stood in the doorway. Dylan Monroe was at the front of the right column because Raven had told him to be, which she would find out later. He pulled into the lot and cut his engine and got off his bike, and he reached into his saddlebag and took out a package wrapped in an oilcloth. He walked toward her. Raven sent this, he said. He wanted to be here. He'll be here by noon. He held out the package. But he wanted this to come first. She took it. It was heavier than it looked. She unwrapped it on the front step. It was a piece of the original copper lantern signed the copper face, the one that had been face down in the gravel the day after the tornado, the one she had picked up and held like something she didn't know what to do with. It had been restored, the damage repaired, the surface treated, the lantern itself repatinated to exactly the age quality of something that had been through weather and persisted, mounted on a backing plate, ready to hang. She held it in both hands. Above the basement entrance, Dylan said. That's where he wants it, if you agree. She looked at the sign. Look at the building behind her, the new kitchen, the expanded dining room, the reinforced walls, the basement door with the certification notice beside it. She looked at 300 bikes in the parking lot, and the highway and the gravel, overflow and partially on the shoulder again, because there still wasn't enough room. Yes, she said. They hung it together, Dylan and 2 other riders, and Tessa standing on the step ladder, directing the level above the basement door. At 8 in the morning, while the sun came up over the Kansas horizon and the parking lot filled with the particular comfortable noise of a large group of people who have arrived somewhere they intended to be. The box came at 9. Dylan brought it to her in the kitchen, where she was coordinating the breakfast service that had spontaneously organized itself with Patty Gerhard running the front and Tessa running the floor, and 3 car riders who apparently knew their way around a commercial kitchen working beside her. He set it on the counter beside her. She looked at it, then at him. Open it, he said. She opened it. The scorch box, the same warped lid was filled with recipe cards. Not her recipe cards. New ones, written in 40 different hands, on cards of different sizes and colors and paper weights, some on index cards, some on notebook pages cut to size, some on the backs of business cards, and one on a piece of packing tape flattened over cardboard. She picked up the first one. Read the title. Read the handwriting careful. Deliberate. Someone who didn't write much but had taken their time. A pot roast recipe. Below the recipe, in smaller writing, my mother made this every Sunday. Her name was Gloria. She would have liked what you're doing. T. Hawkins, Tulsa chapter. She picked up the next one. A bread recipe. Below it, my dad taught me this. He was a trucker too. He said the best places always had fresh bread. He was right. Carl Dallas. She went through them slowly. 20 cards. 40. More. Riders from 8 chapters. Family recipes from women and men she had never met. Food from kitchens in Missouri and Oklahoma and Texas and Colorado and Illinois. Food that had meant something to someone, somewhere, and had been sent here because the person who cooked it wanted it to matter somewhere new. 64 cards, one for each rider who had been in the basement. And in the center, under all the others, in a glassine sleeve that someone had carefully prepared, a card in her own box's typeface, printed and laminated, the text reconstructed from the fragments of the original. Danny's recipe. All of it. She looked at Dylan. How, she said. The fragments were readable enough for the title, and the first two steps, he said. The rest he paused. Raven posted in every chapter group. Asked if anyone knew the recipe by the title and the partial steps. Figured someone's grandmother or mother might have made something close. He paused again. 7 different writers came back with versions of it. A woman in Chicago who studies historical recipes cross-referenced all 7 versions with regional cookbooks from the right era. Spent 2 weeks on it. He looked at the card in the glassine sleeve. She said she can't be certain it's exactly right, but she said it's as close as it can be. Megan looked at the card for a long moment. Then she looked up, past Dylan, through the pass-through window, at the dining room full of people riders and ranchers and truck drivers and the elderly Chepsus from Thursdays and Patty Gerhardt's church friends and the FFA kids and 2 of the families from the tornado and a grandmother from Oklahoma who had been eating cherry pie alone the day the storm came and who had apparently driven back for the reopening. And she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. She had not cried in front of anyone since Danny died. She had cried behind walls and intense and in the dark, in the specific private way of someone who had decided grief was a personal matter. She had cried behind the foundation the night of the tornado and turned around and kept working. She did not turn around now. She stood at the counter of the rebuilt copper lantern with the recipe box in her hands, and she let herself cry in front of everyone. And nobody looked away, and nobody pretended not to see, and nobody said anything at all for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would be better than the silence. Then Patty Gerhardt's voice came from the front, brisk and fond and completely unsentimental. Biscuits are getting cold, Megan. And the dining room laughed. And Megan laughed through what she was feeling, and she set the recipe box in the corner of the counter where she could see it from the grill. And she went back to work. At noon exactly, a single bike pulled into the lot. Raven dismounted, came through the front door, looked at the room, looked at her through the pass-through window, and held up 2 fingers in a question. She held up a plate. He sat at the counter, third stool from the left, which was where he had sat the first time, and which she suspected was not an accident. She put eggs over hard and wheat toast in the window. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." And the copper lantern was open. The copper lantern reopened on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, it felt like it had never closed. Not because the building was the same, it wasn't. And anyone who had known the original could see the differences immediately. The kitchen was larger. The dining room had 6 more seats. The basement door was wider, the certification notice beside it, printed on good stock and framed in a way that made it look like what it was, something to be proud of, not complied with. The copper lantern face above the basement entrance caught the morning light differently than the old sign had, because it had been through something and come out shaped by it, the way things do when they survive. But the smell was the same. Coffee and biscuit dough, and something savory on the flat top, the particular layered warmth of a kitchen that had been running since before dawn. That smell had a specific effect on people who had been on the road for hours. It reached them before they were fully through the door. And it did something to their shoulders the way shoulders drop when a person arrives somewhere they didn't know they needed to be. Truckers found them first. The network spread the way. Trucker networks always do radio and lot talk and the informal geography of people who know every reliable stop between here and there. By the end of the first week, the copper lantern was listed in 3 separate CB channel shorthand codes for reliable food. Fair price, good shelter. That last part, good shelter, was new. The original roadhouse had never been on any emergency route. The rebuilt one was. The county emergency management office had added it to the official severe weather map 3 days after certification. Hofstede had made the call himself, which she found out from Rachel, who found out from someone at the commission who thought Megan should know. She hadn't called Hofstede to thank him. She'd sent a piece of cherry pie to his office by way of Tessa, who delivered it with the diplomatic neutrality of someone who had learned exactly when not to add commentary. Hofstede sent back an empty plate and a note that said, "Fair warning, I'll be back for a piece myself." He came the following Tuesday. He sat at the counter and ate cherry pie and black coffee, and he and Megan talked about the county's shelter coverage gaps for 45 minutes. The way two people talk when they have both been thinking about the same problem from different angles for a long time and have finally found the opportunity to compare notes. There are 11 businesses on the Route 9 corridor with basements capable of shelter use, he said. None of them are certified. Most of them don't know the process. I know the process now, she said. He looked at her over his coffee. I was hoping you'd say that. That was the beginning of what Rachel would later call the expansion. Though Megan never used that word because it implied a plan larger than what she had, which was simply a willingness to answer the phone when other business owners called, and they did call, because word had gotten out that Megan Hartwell had certified a public shelter on a budget that should have been impossible and had done it without the county's help until the county came around, and people who had been told no 100 times wanted to know how she'd done it. She told them. She told them about Frank Delgado's drawings, about the grant program, about Rachel's numbers. She told them which inspector questions to expect and which contractors in the region did this kind of work. She told them it was not fast and it was not easy and it was absolutely worth doing. And she said it without evangelical enthusiasm because that wasn't her register, just with the matter-of-fact conviction of someone reporting on something they knew to be true. 3 businesses on the Route 9 corridor began their certification processes within 2 months of the Copper Lantern reopening. 2 of them called Frank Delgado directly. He had apparently made himself available for exactly this purpose, without announcing it to Megan, which she discovered when the second call came in, and the owner mentioned that the engineer you worked with had already given them a preliminary consult for free. She called Frank. "You're consulting for free," she said. "My cost of living is low," he said. "My son is fine. I've got time." Frank Megan. His voice was dry and warm. "Let an old man be useful." She let him. The Open Door Storm Fund came from Rachel. Technically, the name was Megan's. The mechanics were Rachel's, the nonprofit filing, the bank structure, the grant-eligible framework that would allow donations to be directed specifically to rural highway businesses building emergency shelter capacity. Rachel had drafted the paperwork in the first 2 weeks after reopening, at the kitchen counter of the Copper Lantern during the hours after close, fueled by Megan's coffee and her own considerable organizational fury at the inefficiency of the existing system. "The state has money for this," Rachel said, on the night she explained it. "It's sitting in the infrastructure grant pool. The problem is nobody rural knows how to apply for it, and nobody at the state level is motivated to go find them. So we find them," Megan said. "So we find them." Rachel turned the laptop around to show the draft. "The fund acts as an intermediary. We identify eligible businesses, help them complete the application, and advocate with the state office for prioritization." She paused. "It's not glamorous work." "Since when have I done glamorous work?" Rachel looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, not the careful, managed laugh she used in professional contexts, but the real one, the one Megan hadn't heard enough of since their mother died, and Rachel had become the responsible sister in the way people become things that the situation requires. "Since never," Rachel said. "Not once in your entire life." The fund was officially established 6 weeks after reopening. Harold Meacham made the first private donation, $10,000, which he delivered in person with a certified check and a silence that communicated everything about why. The second donation came from a trucking company based in Omaha, whose drivers used the Route 9 corridor and whose safety officer had read about the Copper Lantern in an industry newsletter. The third came from an anonymous donor in Chicago who sent a check with no note. Megan had a theory about the anonymous donor. She didn't pursue the theory. Some things were gifts precisely because they came without an obligation to understand them. It was Rachel who first noticed that something was changing in Red Willow. Not dramatically. Not the kind of change that announces itself in a headline or a commission vote. The incremental kind, the kind that accumulates in small social behaviors until someone pays attention and realizes the aggregate. People are stopping here, Rachel said one afternoon. She was at her usual spot at the counter, laptop open. Not just truckers and travelers. People from town. Megan looked up from the prep she was doing. People from town have always come here. The Thursday chess table has 8 people now. It was 4 when I first came out. That was true. The 4 retired farmers had become 8, and then 10, and they had stopped being exclusively retired. Farmers. There was now a 62-year-old woman named Barbara who had moved to Red Willow from Topeka after her husband died, and who played chess with a focused aggression that had destroyed 3 of the farmers' self-assessments in 2 weeks. There was a retired teacher named Gordon who didn't play chess but came for the coffee and the company and had, without being asked, become the person who explained the rules to newcomers. People feel safe here, Rachel said. She said it simply, as a fact, not just physically safe, like they can stay. Megan thought about that, about the specific thing she had tried to build 8 years ago when she'd opened the Roadhouse, and how she had always thought of it as shelter in the practical sense, food, warmth, no questions. She hadn't thought about safety as a social phenomenon, as something that spread. She was thinking about it now. That's what the shelter did, she said slowly. Not the physical shelter. What happened in it? She paused. People sat in that basement together during the worst storm in this county in 15 years. Strangers. And they survived it together. And they've been carrying that with them. Rachel looked at her. The grandmother from Oklahoma came back. I know. She's here every Tuesday now. Her name is Irene, Rachel said. She told me she drives 80 miles. Megan was quiet. 80 miles, Rachel said again, letting it land. Raven came back in September. He had been back twice before, once in August for 3 days, once in late August for a single night when his chapter was passing through, and he'd stopped to check the shelter, modifications, and stayed for dinner and left at first light. Each time had been exactly what it was, not more, not less, and Megan had stopped trying to name what it was, because naming it would have required her to stand still long enough to examine it properly, and she had not yet had the stillness for that. In September, he came alone. He pulled in on a Wednesday afternoon, which was her inventory day, which meant she was in the storage room counting cans when Tessa came to the door and said, "Raven's here." "Alone?" Megan said. "Alone." She finished counting the cans she was on and wrote the number down and came out. He was at the counter, third stool from the left. She had stopped being surprised by this. She poured him coffee without being asked. He said thank you without being told. "Chapters in Colorado," he said. "I came down." She looked at him. Kansas was not between Colorado and anywhere. Hell's Angels business regularly took a chapter. "Detour," she said. Yeah, she leaned against the counter across from him. The lunch service was done. The dinner prep wasn't started. And the dining room held exactly 3 people, 2 truckers, who had been driving since 4 in the morning and were working through the last of their coffee before heading back to their rig. And Irene from Oklahoma, who came on Tuesdays but had started coming on Wednesdays too and was doing a crossword puzzle without looking up. "How's the shoulder?" Megan said. "You're favoring it." He looked at her. "You've been watching." "I watch everyone," she said. "It's how I run a kitchen." He turned the coffee cup a quarter turn, the same gesture she'd noticed the first day. The particular habit of a man who thought with his hands but didn't gesture. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. When does it stop feeling like it could all go wrong again?" She was quiet for a moment. She hadn't expected that question. Not because it was intimate. She had come to understand that he asked intimate things the same way he asked practical ones, directly, without apology, but because it was the question she had been asking herself for weeks without a satisfactory answer. "I don't know that it does," she said, honestly. "I think you stop waiting for it to go wrong and start dealing with it when it does, which is different." He looked at his coffee. "That's not a comfortable answer." "No," she agreed. but it's the true one. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been doing what I do for 26 years. Moving. Responsible to the chapter, to the road, to whatever's next. He paused. I'm not good at staying. I know, she said. But I'm trying to figure out. He stopped. Grant, she said. He looked up. I'm not asking you to stay, she said. I'm not asking you for anything. What you did here, she paused, you came when I needed it, and you did more than anyone had a right to expect, and you did it the right way. That's already more than most people manage in a lifetime. She looked at him steadily. Whatever comes next doesn't have to be anything more than what it is. He looked at her for a long time. What if I wanted to be more, he said. He said it quietly, the way he said all the things that mattered. The dining room was very quiet. The two truckers had left while they were talking. Irene was doing her crossword with the focused serenity of a woman who had lived long enough to know when to not be present, even when she was. Then you show up, Megan said. That's all. You just show up. I showed up in September, he said. You did. And August. Twice, she said. And July, I remember July, she said. He held her gaze. Something in his face had let go that absolute control he maintained over his expression, and what was underneath it was not soft exactly. But it was honest, and it was entirely without performance. I'll be back in October, he said. I'll have coffee ready, she said. The severe weather warning came in October. Not a drill, not a simulation. A real National Weather Service alert, issued at 4:17 in the afternoon. On a Thursday, the watch upgraded to a warning at 4:49, with rotation confirmed on the ground 12 miles southwest and moving northeast at 31 miles per hour. Megan heard it on the weather radio at 4:51. She was not alone. The Thursday chess group was in full session, 12 people, including Barbara and Gordon and 3 of the original farmers and a young man of about 30 who had started coming 3 weeks ago and who nobody had asked about because nobody needed to ask. 2 truckers were at the counter. Irene was at her usual table. A family of 4 parents, 2 young children was finishing a late lunch, the kids drawing on the paper that Tessa kept behind the counter for exactly that purpose. A young man, maybe 20, was sitting alone at the corner table with a backpack and a cup of coffee, reading. He had come in 2 hours ago, paid in exact change, asked for a refill once, and had the specific invisible quality of someone who was used to not being noticed. When the radio went, Megan looked at the room and the room looked at her. Basement, she said. Same as always, kids first, then everyone else. Tessa, take the family. Tessa was already moving. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not the controlled chaos of the tornado 18 months ago, when she had stood in the doorway of a room full of strangers and screamed and convinced 64 reluctant men to trust her with their lives. What happened in the next 4 minutes was orderly. Not without tension, the parents of the young children moved fast. The mother holding both kids against her with the grip of someone who had played this scenario in her head and was now executing it. Gordon folded his crossword and went to help Irene, which Irene did not need, but which she accepted with the grace of someone who understood that being helped was itself a gift to the person helping. The 2 truckers went without being told. Barbara cleared the chessboard in 12 seconds. Megan saw it and found it remarkable. Later, that Barbara's first instinct was to clear the board, to preserve the game, to not leave it, to be knocked over by whatever was coming. It said something about Barbara that Megan would think about for a long time. The young man with the backpack was the last to move because he had been in his own world and the radio hadn't reached him immediately. He looked up to find the room emptying and found Megan at his table. Basement, she said, come on. He looked at her. He was young, 20, maybe 21, and he had the look of someone who was far from home and had been for a while. I don't want to be any trouble, he said. You're not trouble, she said. You're a person in a building I'm responsible for. Come on. He came. She went down last. She checked the bathrooms, the storage room, the kitchen. She threw the main breaker the way she had learned to do it early, controlled, before the storm made the decision for her. She went down the new stairwell, solid under her feet, and she pulled the reinforced door and threw both bolts. 23 people in the basement. Capacity 100. The emergency lanterns were already on, triggered by the breaker throw, which was a modification Frank had suggested, and which had taken an electrician from Wichita one afternoon to implement. The weather radios were broadcasting. The medical cabinet was exactly where it always was. She moved through the room. The young children were sitting against the east wall with Tessa, the older one maybe 6, holding the younger one's hand with the seriousness of a child who has decided to be brave. Megan crouched down to them. "What's your name?" she asked the older one. "Lily," the girl said. "Hi, Lily, do you know what this room is for?" "Staying safe," Lily said. "That's exactly right. You're doing great." She stood up. The storm was audible now, not the freight train roar. Not yet, but the preliminary sound, the distant application of enormous pressure against a landscape. Several people looked at the ceiling. She watched their faces, and she did not look at the ceiling herself. "It's holding," she said before anyone asked. "This ceiling will hold." Gordon was beside Irene, who was sitting in the calmest possible posture, back straight, hands folded, the posture of an 81-year-old woman who had survived a great deal and had organized her relationship with the world's dangers into something manageable. She caught Megan's eye and nodded once, which said everything it needed to say. The young man with the backpack was against the west wall, standing close to the engraved names. He was reading them, not quickly, slowly, the way you read something that surprises you. He looked up when Megan came toward him. "I didn't know about this place," he said. "I just stopped for coffee." "A lot of people just stop for coffee," she said. He looked at the names. 64 names, he said. "What happened here?" She told him the short version: a tornado, a basement, 67 people who survived because the door was open and the floor held. She told him about the riders and the rebuilding. She told him about the 4 words below the names, which he had already read, but which she said aloud anyway. "No one faces the storm alone." He was quiet for a moment. Above them, the storm was louder now, the kind of loud that rearranges your relationship to the concept of loud. "I've been traveling for 6 months, he said. "I left home after." He stopped. "It doesn't matter why I left. I just haven't had anywhere to." He stopped again. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I know." He paused. "I just thought someone should know." She looked at him for a moment. 20 years old, backpack, exact change for coffee. Far from wherever he'd started and not sure what direction to go next. "When this is over," she said, "you sit down and let me feed you properly. Not just coffee." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be expected. "Okay," he said. The storm peaked and passed in 11 minutes. When it was done, when the sound had diminished and the pressure had equalized, and she heard ordinary silence through the ventilation pipe, she threw the bolts and opened the door, and 23 people climbed back upstairs into a building that was entirely intact. The warning area had been 2 miles south. The rotation had lifted before reaching Red Willow. Nobody had lost anything. Nobody was hurt. But the basement had been used. That was the thing. Not as a near-miss exercise, not as a precaution for something that hadn't materialized, but as exactly what it was designed to be: a place where 23 people had sat in the dark while something large moved past them, and had been safe because the door was open and the floor held, and someone had spent 2 years making sure of it. Megan went upstairs and made coffee. She made it in the amount that a full house needed, because by the time it was brewed, the dining room would be full again. She knew this the way she knew most things about this building, from 8 years of paying attention to how people moved and what they needed. She was right. Within 20 minutes, every table was occupied. The chess group had reconvened with Barbara already positioning her opening, and Irene was back at her crossword with a fresh cup and the specific contentment of someone who has come through something and found themselves still themselves on the other side. The young man with the backpack sat at the counter. She put a plate in front of him without being asked. Eggs and toast and the last of the morning's biscuits, which she had held back specifically for reasons she hadn't consciously articulated at the time, but which felt now exactly right. He ate the way Dylan Monroe had eaten on the first day, fast at first, Then slower then, with a kind of attention that was almost deliberate, as if he were trying to be present for it. She watched him from the kitchen with the same peripheral awareness she brought to everything in this building. He finished. He sat with his empty plate and his refilled coffee. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She was wiping down the counter. "Sure." The sign above the door, the copper one. "Is that the original?" "Part of it," she said. "The part that survived." He nodded. He looked at his coffee. "I think I'm going to stay for a while," he said. "In Red Willow, if there's any work." She looked at him. "What kind of work can you do?" "Kitchen work, mostly. I worked at a diner for 2 years before I left." She set down the cloth. "You any good?" "Good enough," I said. "I'm better than I was." She looked at him for a moment, with the same assessing attention she brought to everything that mattered. Then she looked at Tessa, who was at the other end of the counter and had been listening with the diplomatic neutrality of someone who had learned exactly when to be nearby. Tessa looked back at her and said nothing, which was how Tessa said yes. "Come in tomorrow at 6, Megan said. "We'll see how you do." His name, she found out when she asked him to write it on the schedule, was Marcus Webb. He was from Indiana. He had left because of circumstances he would explain, eventually, over the course of several weeks in small pieces at the end of the lunch service. The way people explain things when they trust the place they're explaining them in. He turned out to be better than good enough. He turned out to be the thing that kitchens occasionally produce. A natural, someone who cooked with instinct and took instruction well and had the particular combination of speed and care that made a service run smooth. Within a month, Megan trusted him with the morning prep, which was the highest trust she had in the building. He was still there when the second anniversary of the tornado came. Raven was there too. He had arrived the day before October this time, as he'd said, and had helped Tessa hang the new weather radio by the front entrance, the one the county emergency management office had provided as part of a corridor-wide installation. He had done it with a level and proper anchors, which she found charming in the specific way she found all his practical competence charming, though she would never use that word to him. They had dinner at the counter after close, the two of them, and Rachel and Tessa and Marcus, who had become, without ceremony, part of the inner circle of the copper lantern, the way people become part of things when they show up reliably and do the work and don't make it about themselves. Rachel told them about the Open Door Storm Fund, which had now helped 7 businesses in 3 counties begin their certification processes. 4 were complete. 3 were in progress. Tessa told them about the Route 9 corporate trucking companies that had started pooling to cover the fund's operating costs, which meant it was now self-sustaining without Megan's direct financial input. Marcus was quiet through most of it, listening with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood they were being included in something and took that seriously. At the end of the evening, when the others had gone, and it was just Megan and Raven in the closed dining room, he said, "You know what's happening here." She was stacking chairs. "I know what's happening here. It's spreading," he said. "What you built, the way it works, it's spreading." "It was always going to spread," she said. "That's what useful things do." He was quiet for a moment. "Eddie would have loved this place," he said. She stopped stacking. She set the chair down and looked at him. "Tell me something about him," she said. "Something that's not from the memorial." He thought about it. Not quickly, he turned it over, the way he turned everything over, with the patience of someone who believed that the right answer was worth the time it took to find it. "He made terrible coffee," Raven said. 22 years, every chapter run, he volunteered to make the coffee, and every time it was terrible. Completely undrinkable. And every time, every single person in the chapter drank it and said nothing, because refusing Eddie's coffee was, he paused, it was not something you did. Not because he'd be upset, because he was so genuinely happy to make it. He'd stand there with this completely satisfied expression and watch you drink it, and it tasted like road tar and burnt rubber, and you drank every drop. He paused again. "I would give a great deal for one more cup of Eddie's terrible coffee." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't need to be large to mean something. "I'll make you a cup tomorrow," she said. "I'll do my best to make it terrible." He laughed. The real laugh, not the ghost of one, the full thing. Present and unguarded. The laugh of someone who has been around enough loss to understand that joy is not a betrayal of it. She turned the lights off one by one. She went to the door. She turned to the sign, not the overhead neon, just the smaller one in the window, the hand-painted one Tessa had made that said, "Open" on one side and "Rest Stop" on the other. Because Megan had decided a long time ago that closed was not the right word for what the copper lantern ever truly was. She turned it to "Rest Stop." She switched on the copper lantern above the basement door, the original piece, the restored face, the part that had survived, and its light reached out through the front and one window and onto the parking lot and the highway beyond, the way a lamp in a window reaches out without asking anything in return. Raven stood behind her. "She thought she had only opened a basement door," he said quietly. She looked at the light on the highway. "What did she open?" she said. He put his hand on the door frame beside her. "A door none of us would ever allow to close again," he said. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and wide, and somewhere along the 26 miles of highway that ran through Red Willow County, 7 other basement doors were certified and unlocked and ready, and the Storm Fund had a balance and a purpose and a growing list of names. And a grandmother from Oklahoma was already planning her Tuesday drive, and a kid from Indiana was setting his alarm for 5:30, and 300 riders knew exactly which exit to take when the road brought them back through Kansas. The copper lantern burned against the dark. The shelter stayed open. And that was enough more than Megan Hartwell had dared to ask for. On the night she sat behind a broken wall and cried alone, and everything she had quietly, stubbornly, completely believed was possible from the moment she stood up, brushed the concrete dust off her jeans, and went back to work.